Greetings, friends. I still plan to do a video on what was wrong with the Church of Martin Luther's time in the 16th century. This video will give you an idea as to some of the things that were going on, but I made the focus of this video the notion of the separation of church and state. Was it ever a real thing or just an ideal? Lately, I've been consuming a lot of medieval history, so most of what I'm going to say here relates to that time period. How did the church affect the medieval state? I'm aware that the modern nation-state did not exist in the Middle Ages, though there was a close semblance in the powerful cities of the High Middle Ages. What's the situation today? Obviously, we take it for granted that no church ought to dictate state affairs. But on closer inspection, is it true? And if it's not true, should we expect anything different? While government is supposed to function as an independent organization, can we really say the same of the people employed in government? Much of what you think about this may depend on how flexible your concept of the church is, but I'll elaborate further on. For the sake of not making this video too long, I won't be discussing the Byzantine Empire and its version of Christianity or any of the other forms of Christianity like Arianism and goes on and on, all the interesting things that were happening in the Middle East. There were Coptic Christians in Egypt, but I'm going to focus on the Roman Catholic Church before the Reformation. The idea of the separation of church and state was born in the Middle Ages. It was thought proper for church officials to abstain from controlling European states, as we would like to think today. And their duty was supposed to be limited to getting the European rulers to do two things. Firstly, to respect their subjects as Christians, i.e. not indiscriminately murdering them and stealing their cattle. And secondly, not to harm the church. In other words, burning monasteries, killing monks, burning Bibles, not to mention taxing the church. There was always tension in the notion of separation of church and state, because about 95% of European society was composed of Christians, and they saw themselves as part of a united body. But during the Dark Ages, especially during the 9th century, in the time of the Carolingian Empire, the church wasn't strong enough to tell kings what to do in an explicit and formal sense, but that would change over time. One of the big ways the church exercised social power was by the threat of excommunication. Being excommunicated means you're no longer a part of the church, and this time it meant you're no longer accepted in general society because everyone's a Christian, they belong to this unified body. Don't talk to anyone who's excommunicated. They may as well be a pagan or a heretic. I don't know what actually happened for common people, but it was mostly for royals where they would, kings, England and France, and the popes would sometimes get them to change what they were doing, like marry this person, or you can't divorce that person, you have to stay married. But today, it's very different, of course. I mean, I guess you could say the Catholic Church is very dominant in Latin America. I can't imagine it being quite the same as what happens in medieval society, but perhaps if you live in a small town in Latin America or some other part of the world, I don't know, in Mormon, Utah, being outside the church, being shunned, yeah, that would be much more serious. But generally in the West, at least in the Anglo world, steadily diluting Anglo world, but we get this, plethora of churches, and there's Catholic churches, there's everything. There's many Protestant denominations. So I mean, being excommunicated nowadays in this situation, it's like, okay, it's not the end of the world. The so-called papal monarchy rose during the 12th century and continued during the 13th century. This was a time when the church had great, even overwhelming political power. In these years, the popes would crown the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which is to say the German Empire. They would crown the king of the Franks, essentially. He would kneel at the feet of the pope, kiss the pope's feet, and the pope would then crown him in a ceremony. This was a different custom from the earlier Middle Ages, when the so-called divine right of kings was widely recognized. The divine right of kings held that by virtue of being king, of having risen to a position of dominant power, God had given the king his blessing. It's obviously self-serving, as any thug can kill an innocent man and claim it was ordained by God, and he'd be right and wrong at the same time, which says essentially nothing. At the same time, the divine right of kings was no more self-serving than the church. In some sense, it was more honest, because the king had probably demonstrated military prowess and real skills, whereas the papacy represented the shell of the disintegrated Roman Empire. Though the papacy had real wealth and some limited armies, it got power mostly from its rituals and teachings. How many of these rituals and teachings were based on scripture is something we can discuss in the future. It owned a lot of land in an intricate patronage system from which it derived a relatively small income, though it collected regular payments from all the other states in Western Christendom. The church also had a separate legal system which settled all kinds of disputes from society. For example, if people wanted to annul a marriage, and by the way, you couldn't get divorced back then, but you could get the church to grant that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Maybe you were too closely related to the bride or something like that. But I don't know that's what royals did. I don't know if common people would be able to, pay because later they had to pay for this. I don't know earlier on, but certainly later on the church began charging money for this sort of stuff. Judges, lawyers, all dedicated to the canon law. Pope Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216, had been a canon lawyer. And these canon lawyers put together everything the church fathers had said and all decrees issued by councils to make a codification of canon law. Meanwhile, the Vatican in Rome functioned as its own state, except for a large portion of the 14th century when the Pope was in Avignon, France. The papacy was always connected to certain ethnicities, and the Italians wanted the papacy to stay in Rome, of course, preferably with an Italian at the head, and the French nobles had reasons to back a French pope. In some ways, the medieval Catholic Church was very similar to the kingdoms of princes. They even fielded mercenaries to fight on their behalf. Keep in mind that the medieval period was very geopolitically unstable. The Western Roman Empire had been collapsing in stages since the 4th century, but it wasn't until the 5th century, specifically 476 of the Common Era, that this last final collapse occurred. And even then, the peoples at the time still saw themselves as belonging to the Roman world, but the barbarians were now fully in charge, specifically the German partially Latinized barbarians. And this begins the period sometimes called the Dark Ages, or the Migration period, or just the early Middle Ages, stretching up to 800 of the Common Era. So that's several centuries there. 800 because Charlemagne comes to power, king of the Franks, very strong man, who briefly has an empire, the Carolingian Empire. His sons held on to it, but I think, within a few generations, that empire already began to dissolve. So you could stretch the Dark Ages up to the year 1000 if you wish. And this was a time characterized with a lot of warfare, a disappearance of city life for the most part, difficult for the church to impose a unified teaching on the peoples. People respond, society responded to this in part with monasticism. That was a way to retreat from all of it. And it wasn't until after the year 1000 that city life began to pick up again. So for all that intervening time, people had learned how to survive in all of this chaos, and that is to rely on that which you can see, your local lord, not some far-off king. Not only was there internal instability because there were no modern nation states in what is now France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, the lords could fight each other. They could fight bishops and barons. There'd be all sorts of alliances going on. So besides the internal instability, there were threats of invasions constantly from pagan nations. There were longboat sailing Vikings from Scandinavia and horse-riding warriors from Central Asia. The most serious threat to Europe was from the expanding Islamic world in North Africa. What the Arabs colonized is pretty much still part of the Muslim world today, not Spain, of course. So, of course, there was the double threat from Asia Minor through Strait of Bosphorus into Greece and there into the Balkans, or from the Strait of Gibraltar, or just from that, that end of the Mediterranean. And Spain, it went back and forth. Because Islam itself is a recent creation. It wasn't even, it was a few centuries after Jesus Christ's what they say was Jesus Christ's time when Islam came about, when Muhammad was doing his thing, and then, but of course it spread very fast. So you've got all these very real threats to any sort of national existence, or at least any existence for the future of Christianity, or the future of the German Empire, or the various European races, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, Frank. And in this time of war, the political influence of the papacy was perhaps most visible during the Crusades, which followed the Dark Ages. In 1095, Pope Urban II gave a heavily influential speech which set the First Crusade in motion. He mentioned the violence of society that I've been describing. He also mentioned what was known as the peace of God, the idea that Christians should respect each other. He talked about helping the Greeks, the Byzantine Empire, which was also Christian, although not Catholic. And they had asked for assistance. They were basically the continuation of the Roman Empire, because while it collapsed in the West, it survived for another 1,000 years or so in the East, although there were some interruptions, and then basically for most of that time they were steadily shrinking. They had threats from the Persians and later from Islam. They didn't always get along with the West. Most of the time they didn't get along. But at this time in history, there was a real impetus, not just from above, but from below, from the grassroots level, to recapture the Holy Land. This is what Urban also mentioned. He mentioned the crimes being committed against Christians in the East, and what is now, Syria. He mentioned a new kind of war, an armed pilgrimage, where you could get rewards in heaven, and you would be forgiven your sins if you partook in this undertaking. Seems kind of like a jihad to me, I gotta say. It seems kind of Islamic to me, but maybe that's just the violence of the times. Now, Urban's call resulted in roughly 100,000 people from various parts of the continent, Europe, traveling to the Middle East for the First Crusade, which was militarily successful at capturing Jerusalem from the Muslims and establishing a small Christian state there. And of course, the Crusader lords could have their own fiefdoms there. Now, I'm not actually making fun of the Crusades and saying it was, the equivalent of Halliburton, pushing for the invasion of Iraq so it can get oil deals. That's not, I'm not simplifying it. There was a real threat from Islam. There was a real cultural undercurrent for this thing. Nonetheless, there was little strategic value in capturing Palestine. How would that stem the Muslim threat from Asia Minor and in the West, Morocco? It wouldn't really. And the Crusades after the first would increasingly fail, get out of hand. At one point, they even sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. By the 14th century, kings were beginning to reassert their power, especially in England and France. When Pope Boniface VIII intended to excommunicate Philip IV of France in 1303, one of Philip's counselors took an army and managed to arrest Boniface for several days, during which time he was beaten, and he ended up dying not long afterwards. This marked the beginning of the end of the papal monarchy. It was trying to be Rome of old, but it didn't have the economic power and armies to really do that, but it made an impressive try. So we cannot say that the church was somehow disconnected from worldly affairs. It never intended to have a direct role in running affairs. That was for kings and later for democracies. The church preferred to remain behind the scenes. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century seriously checked the power of Rome, but the concept of a church continued to be very important for most Christians. Most of the English settlers along the east coast of America were Protestants, and they set up their new churches. By the time of the ratification of the United States Constitution in 1787 and 1788, the leaders of society accepted that, or the leaders of American society accepted that church and state were to stay formally separate. At the same time, there were very influential religious groups that could dominate politics if they possessed a majority. And if ministers influence how their congregations vote, how can you say church is separate from the state? It just means the church doesn't get its hands dirty. A separation of church and state is a useful illusion. Any gathering of people necessarily has an effect on the world, even if you're just meditating or playing video games. Maybe the effect on the world will be small, maybe big, maybe it'll be unintended, but everyone exists here on earth. We cannot help but influence others all the time. Separation of church and state was never about keeping the spiritual out of the political. It was just about powerful actors placing a check on another very powerful actor. And I don't mean in a theater. Churches in the United States have been mostly exempt from taxes for a long time. The justification has been that they are above worldly affairs and they're not supposed to engage in politics. And we all know that's not true, but it's a useful ideal. And at the same time, they rake in a lot of money. Some of these big churches, who knows how much money they're collecting from their congregations, and the government is itching to get it. I'm going to read a short quote from a June 26, 2018 article from Politico, not a source I would trust, it's mainstream. I checked other sources, this is a fact. So, quote, Republicans have quietly imposed a new tax on churches, synagogues, and other non-profits. A little noticed and surprising change that could cost some groups tens of thousands of dollars. Their recent tax code rewrite requires churches, hospitals, colleges, orchestras, and other historically tax-exempt organizations to begin paying a 21% tax on some types of fringe benefits they provide their employees. End quote. Apparently, it may be appealed. I'm not sure what this current situation is. I would say that this is not as drastic as taxing what they collect from their congregations, but it is a step in that direction. And I would say it's a bad direction to go in, not because the spiritual and the political can ever be completely separated, but just because it's bad politics, just like the medieval popes telling kings who they could marry was bad politics. I said at the beginning that how you view the separation of church and state depends on how flexible you are with these terms. Allow us to substitute the word faith for church. And I know it's not entirely fair, I admit, because faith doesn't necessarily imply a gathering of people the way a church does. However, faith is inextricably connected to the concept of church. A state cannot function without faith. Faith is a series of fundamental principles or axioms which give us a certain worldview and affect how we act. Here are some examples. Some pagans worshipped idols and nature spirits. Pre-Norman conquest Anglo-Saxons valued kinship as the decisive factor in whether to put your life in danger. Christians believe there is only one God. Materialists believe all of reality can be explained by material effects. Those are very important principles for these people, but not all the principles. I can't go on and on. In summary, we may not all have the same principles, but all people must have some principles, even though some people look degenerate to us. It's just that they don't value things the way we do. I'm not saying that degenerate people are not degenerate, or that there is no ultimate truth. I do believe there's ultimate truth. In some sense, a sin is a sin, and you'll be judged for your actions no matter what culture you belong to. But just as a lens to look how these principles affect our worldview, you can see how certain cultures have different principles. Yeah, it's a different discussion if you want to, get into the ultimate questions, or what are the best principles. That's a good debate to have. I agree. So we are always acting based on faith. We all get together, we're affected by our groups. Not everyone's going to agree with how I'm using the language here. It's more of a thought experiment. If anything, it should be showing you how tenuous church and state as separate entities are. That's really what I'm just trying to get at here, even if you don't agree with how loose I'm using the words church and state and faith. Now, I've been speaking in this video sort of with the seeming assumption that society and the state and the leaders of the state are all on the same page. Well, I haven't always been, but that's sort of that was the assumption in Christianity. But of course, we know that the world leaders today often don't give a damn about their citizens. But of course, they have their principles. It may just be valuing their own family above their own citizens. Who cares about their citizens? That's a different species of human. And that brings us to the modern left. They are, of course, a religion too, much more clearly a religion. I would say perhaps satanic and atheistic. I mean, those two things feed into each other. In some ways, they're pagan, and you could call them degenerate. I mean, they have now, even like many pagans before them, begun a sacrificial cult. It's called Me Too, and they get sacrificial victims for this cult, although they don't always kill the victims, but sometimes the victims commit suicide. The modern left is a religion, and they scoff at Christianity, but they have their own principles. What are they? Well, I mean, I don't know what all of their principles are, but they obviously value the feminization of society and the racial diversification of society as a supreme good. Nothing's changed. There never was a separation of church and state in the deep sense. In the narrow sense of a political body, yes, a useful ideal to try and keep it apart. Try. But in the broad sense, the church and the state are always connected fundamentally. Hasta luego, amigos.